So finally, let's get started with our first key pain point, our first area of improvement, and that would be names. In this module, we are going to focus on naming things, so on assigning good names. We'll focus on all the nameable things in development, which would be variables, constants, and properties, functions and methods, and of course also classes. We are going to explore why names matter exactly and how good names can help us. We'll then, most importantly, dive into rules and concepts for assigning good names, and we'll compare these names to bad names to really see the difference. And of course, as promised, we'll have plenty of small examples and demos, and also a challenge for you at the end of this module to apply what you learned. When it comes to naming things in development, there is one simple overarching rule, and that would be that names should be meaningful. This really is all. This is the core idea. Whenever you name something, no matter if that's a variable or a function or a class, the name should be meaningful. It should transport what's stored in a variable or what a function or method does without having to look at the code inside of that function or method, or without exploring the values stored in a variable. For example, consider this code snippet. It's not a lot of lines, but it's really not clear at all what's going on there. Const as equals new main entity, as process, if login. What are we doing there? What's this main entity? What does process do? And what is the value of login? Is it a function for which existence we check? Is it a Boolean value? Is it a string, an error code? We don't know at all. And now consider this alternative. It's the same code, but it's way clearer. It's now obvious that we are creating a user, which we are then saving, maybe to a file or to a database. This might not matter to us, but we are saving the user, and we got is logged in instead of login, making it clear that this very likely holds the result of checking whether that user is logged in or not, so a Boolean value, true or false. This is now very readable and very easy to understand, even though it's the same number of lines. The only difference is that now we have meaningful names. So picking good names in your code really matters. If we have well-named things, variables and so on, in our code, we allow our readers, so the people reading our code, to understand that code without going through all the details, without diving into it in detail. Consider these examples. In all three examples, it's pretty clear what this code does, even though we don't know the details. We don't need to dive into the rest of the code just to understand these snippets. That's why names matter. Now, I will emphasize right away, we will not always agree, because obviously there is more than one way of naming something. In this course section, I'll explore the rules we can follow to come up with good names, but ultimately you will still always have more than one option. For example, here, this is readable, I would say. We are probably creating some admin user, but this here is also readable and not necessarily worse. You could definitely find arguments for either of the two names, and it's up to you how you want to name something in such cases. There are, however, also names which clearly are bad, and that's what I'll focus on in this course section, so that by the end of the section you have a clear understanding of what makes up a good name and what makes up a bad name. And then, of course, it's up to you to pick which good name you want to go with. So, before we explore any bad or dirty code, let's dive right in. How do we name things correctly in our code? Well, let's differentiate between these three main blocks which I outlined, and let's have a look at the different rules. Variables and constants, and of course also properties and objects, which would be in the same category, are all data containers, you could say. We use them to store some data. That could be some data entered by a user, for example, in a web application. That could be the result of validating that user input. It could be a list of products, a single product, anything like that. Here, for the names of these variables, constants, and properties, we typically want to use nouns or short phrases with adjectives which describe what's inside of the data container. For example, something like user data or just user. Something like is valid if we store a boolean. These would be good names, and we are going to see way more examples throughout this section. No worries. So that's how we want to name our variables and constants and properties. We want to describe what is being stored in them. Now, when it comes to functions and methods, the idea is a different one. Here, we don't store something in that function. I mean, there is code inside of it, but that code executes once a function is called, and therefore, in the end, functions and methods are, of course, commands which we can execute on demand, or we calculate values which we return. So they are commands or calculated values, you could say. For example, we could have a function which sends data to a server. We could have a function or method which validates some user input. And therefore, for function and method names, we typically go with verbs or, again, short phrases with adjectives. So here we could have something like send data as a name for the function which sends data to a server. Or input is valid for the validation function. Maybe also just is valid. This would also be okay. So here we could have the same name as for the variable on the left, because we want to describe a value which is produced by the function here then. Though I will say that booleans are a special case here. If we had a function which produces a user object, for example, we might want to call that function getUser or createUser or something like that. But again, you will see more examples for these different scenarios throughout this section. Now, when it comes to naming classes, it's important to understand and keep in mind that we use classes in our code to create things, to create objects. For example, a user object or a product or an HTTP request body which we want to parse, something like this. And therefore, for naming classes, we also use nouns or short phrases with nouns, so simply multiple nouns combined with each other. Something like user or request body, which would be these multiple nouns being combined. That's how we want to use classes. And if you keep these basic rules in mind, you already got a good foundation for naming your code correctly, for naming the things in your code correctly. But of course, we're now also going to explore the different niche cases, variations, and then also how to pick the best noun for a given value being stored in a variable, for example. Because using a noun is just a start. Of course, you want to use the best noun which best describes what's inside a variable or what's inside a function and so on. So that's, of course, what we're going to explore throughout this section. Now, before we dive into the concrete examples and the different variations and so on, we also have to stop at the important topic of casing. In programming, we got four main ways of writing our names, four main casings. And that would be snake case, camel case, Pascal case, and kebab case. Now, snake case looks like this. Is valid, send response, where multiple words are separated with an underscore and everything is lowercase. And for example, you use snake case a lot in Python. There, you use it for variable names, for function names, and for method names. And that's what you saw in the initial examples in the first course section already. Now, Python uses snake case. Many other programming languages, like Java or JavaScript, use camel case, which looks like this. Is valid, send response, the same name, but now not with an underscore between words, but instead there is no separation between words except for the starting character of the next word in line. The first character in the name is always a lowercase one, like the I in is valid and the S in send response, but then every word in that phrase starts with an uppercase character, like the uppercase V in valid and the uppercase R in response. Again, this camel case notation is used by many other programming languages, but it's used for the same things as Python uses snake case, and that would be variables, functions, and methods. Now another notation which we know is Pascal case. It looks like this, and this is used by many programming languages, for example by Python and Java and JavaScript, for class names. Class names are typically written in Pascal case. And when it comes to kebab case, it looks like this, and we, for example, know this from HTML, where we can use it to assign names to custom HTML elements we might be building. Now, these are the four main ways of writing things, and mostly it comes down to conventions, when to use which notation. I outlined the most important conventions here. For example, for Python, we use snake case for variables, functions, and methods. And style guides for your favorite programming language typically tell you which notation to use for what. I want to emphasize, of course, that no matter which casing you use, the name in the end is always the same, just the way you write it is different. And therefore, again, which programming language you choose does not really have an impact on how to write clean code. This is just an extra convention you should keep in mind, because of course following language-specific conventions is also a part of writing clean code. So let's now dig a bit deeper, and let's start with variables, constants, and properties. How should these be named? We can differentiate between three main kinds of values which are being stored in them. Our values could be objects, and this includes lists or maps or any other more complex data structure. Our value could be a simple number or string, or our value could be a boolean. And you can already tell by the color coding here that there seems to be a difference between booleans and the other kinds of values. Now, if your value, which you store in a variable, constant, or property, is an object or an object-like thing, then the name which you assign to your variable or property should simply describe the value. So if you are storing a user object in your variable, name the variable user. If you are storing an object which describes a database and offers database operations, you might want to name the variable database. If your value is a number or a string, so some text, then you also just want to describe the value. If you have a variable that holds the name of a user, you might just want to call it name. The same, of course, if it's a property in a user object. If you have a variable or property which holds an age, you might want to call it age, just like that. Now for booleans, there is a special case. For booleans, your name should simply be a question that can be answered with true or false. So you might name your variable something like isActive or logged in, because that can be yes or no, and therefore true or false. You are active or you are not. It's an either or choice. So for booleans, we want this is something naming or names like logged in, which also can be answered with yes or no. Now you might want to consider providing more details and more information where it makes sense, but you don't want to introduce extra redundancy. For example, if your user in a certain branch of your code is always an authenticated user, you could consider naming that variable authenticated user to make it really clear to everyone who reads that code that you're only acting on an authenticated user here. If it's a customer, you could name it customer instead of user to have this more specific name. If it's a SQL database, you could use that as a name to make it really clear which kind of database you are working on. If you store just the first name of a user in a certain field, you might want to name it first name instead of just name, to be more specific about the kind of name being stored in there. On the other hand, I would argue that age is already pretty specific, so you probably can't be more specific there. So it's not about making your names as long as possible, but just about making them as clear and as easy to understand as possible. And sometimes shorter is better, sometimes longer is better. Obviously, this is also something which will come with experience, but also with help of the demos and exercises you will see throughout this course. Now for booleans, it's the same. You can add more details if it makes sense. For example, if isActive refers to a user, you could name it isActiveUser. Logged in, on the other hand, will typically always refer to a user. So for example, using user is logged in instead of just logged in is longer, but not necessarily better. So now that we know how to name variables, constants, and properties, let's see more examples and let's see different variations of names. For that, we will consider what's being stored. We'll then have a look at bad names, at okayish names, and at good names. And let's start with the good old user object again. Let's say we have a variable in which we store a user object. And the same would be true if it's a constant or if it's a property. And let's say that user object is simply the combination of the name of the user, the email address, and the age. Now what could be bad names here? Now bad names for this kind of variable would be something like u or data. U is simply very short and unspecific, and data is also not very specific. These variables could contain anything. It's not clear that they hold some user object. Names which are okay could be user data instead of just data, or person. The problem with user data is that it might have some redundant information attached to it. I mean, if we have a user object, it's clear that it contains data about that user, so we probably don't want to name the variable user data. And for person, that might be too unspecific. It can make sense. I will not say that it's always wrong, but often you might be working on a customer, or on an author, or an instructor, or an administrator. So maybe you want to use these specific versions then. If we would not be storing a user object here, but let's say we would just be collecting data a user entered in some form, and we have a mixture of the entered values and of validation results of us validating these inputs, then we could have a user data variable which holds this bag of entered values and validation results. There, something like that could make more sense, because it would not be the finished user object then, but some intermediate object between collecting the values and creating the user. So that's something to consider. And I'm bringing this up here just to make it clear that a name which might be okay in one scenario might be a good name in another scenario, and vice versa. Just the bad names are really often very bad. So therefore, good names could be user, or as I just said, something more specific like customer. User is pretty descriptive and clear, and customer is even more specific, which often might be the better option to make it really clear which kind of user that is. Of course, if you have an application where a user is really just a user and not necessarily a customer yet, then there is nothing wrong with going with just user, which is why it's listed under good names here. And with that, I got a first little exercise for you. Let's say we're now validating some user input, and it's the result of this validation which is being stored in a variable or in a property. How would you name that? Pause the video for a second and think about bad, okay, and good names, and then we'll have a look at the examples I came up with. So what could be some bad names for this? Well, again, just using a single character is pretty much always bad, with some rare exceptions. So we could use v for the validation result, or something like val. The problem with v is that it could be anything. The problem with val is that we could also think that it stands for value instead of validation result. So these are too unspecific and don't tell us anything. When it comes to okay names, we could have something like correct or validated input. The problem with these names is that they don't imply that they hold true or false values. Correct could be holding any kind of value. It could be true or false, but it could also be some text or anything else. And validated input could hold the value which was validated instead of the validation result. So better options could be is correct or is valid, or something like did validate successfully. These would be names which are descriptive and where it's clear that we have a true or false value stored in there. Now, there will be more examples throughout this course, but this hopefully gives you a first idea on how variables, properties, and constants may be named. So how should we name functions and methods then? Well, here we can also differentiate between functions or methods which do perform some kind of operation, and that really can be any kind of operation. It can be an operation where data in an object gets changed. It can be a calculation which returns a value. But the other kind of function we can have a look at is a function which computes a Boolean specifically, so which returns a Boolean value. Now, for the first case, that we have any kind of operation, the function or method name should really just describe that operation. So for example, getUser makes it really clear that we're getting some user, maybe from a database. Response.send makes it really clear that we're probably sending the response on which we execute this method. Now for the Boolean case, we again want to answer a true or false question, just as with the properties and variables and constants. So here, as an exception, our function could not describe the operation, but instead the result. And this is really only the case for Booleans, where you want to do that. So here your method or your functions could be named isValid or something like a isPaid method on a purchase, to return true if that purchase was paid and false if it wasn't. Now, just as before, more details are always great unless they are redundant. So for example, if we have a function which retrieves a user from a database, but it does so by identifying the user by email, we could name the function getUserByEmail to make it really clear that it's not fetching a user by ID or by any arbitrary criteria, but that it's always the email. Now for response send, on the other hand, this already is pretty clear. Something like response.sendResponse simply wouldn't make a lot of sense. It's clear that we're sending this response. For Booleans, just as before, we can also add more details if it makes sense. For example, if we have a function which validates email addresses specifically, we could name the function emailIsValid instead of just isValid. On the other hand, again, for purchase_isPaid, this is already pretty clear. More details could be added in some use cases and scenarios, but in most scenarios, it's probably good like this. So therefore, it's again time for some specific examples, now on functions and method names, again with bad, okay, and good names. Now let's say we have a function that saves a user or saves user data to a database. How could we name this function or method? Well, bad names would be something like process or handle. This is very generic. These could be doing anything. Yes, it could be processing or handling a user, but we could also be processing an order. So this is not telling us anything. In addition, it's not clear whether process means save or update or delete. It could be anything. So this is definitely very unspecific and not the naming you want to use. Now, when it comes to OK names, we could have something like save or store data. Now, the good thing is that now it's clear that something is being saved, but it's still not necessarily clear what is being saved. Of course, if save is a method on a user object, then it's way clearer, and then save is perfectly fine. But if you just have a function called save, which is not called on an object, but which instead, for example, receives an object as an argument, there might be a better name which you can choose. For example, save user, or you use what I just said, and you instead make that a method on a user object, which now again makes it very clear that it's probably this object which is being saved. Here the intent is very clear, especially if you use the method approach. And again, just as before, we are going to see more examples throughout this section. But before we do that, it's again time for you to pause this video and try this on your own. Let's say we have a function which validates some user input. How would you name that? And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to return true or false. So how would you name this function or this method then? Well, bad names again could be process or now also save. Validating is not the same as saving. We might save after validating something, but first we validate it, and there nothing gets saved. So this is unspecific in the case of process, and even misleading in the case of save. Now, better names could be validate save or check. Validate save could imply that we do both validation and saving, so it's still not ideal, but if that is what we do, it's okay. Check is okay. It makes it clear that we're checking something, but it's also not really specific, and it leaves us guessing. Both names leave us guessing on what's happening exactly. So better names could be validate, or if true or false is returned, is valid. Validate could be called if we are not returning true or false, but if we are, for example, throwing an error if the validation fails. Is valid, on the other hand, is a great name if that function does return true or false. So now we had a closer look at naming variables, properties, and functions and methods. Let's now have a look at naming classes. Here, we don't really have different cases to consider. We should always describe the object which is created when we instantiate the class. And that's important. Keep in mind that classes typically are used to instantiate something. You can have static classes with static methods, but typically you instantiate something, and therefore the class name should reflect which kind of object gets created. Hence, classes might be named something like user or product if they reflect these objects. You can, as always, provide more details if it makes sense and doesn't add redundancy. So your user class could become a customer class, your product class could become a course class if your product is an online course. You can also use more than one word for class names, but you should avoid redundant suffixes, like database manager. It can be intriguing to sometimes use names like this, but always consider that classes are typically instantiated. And if you do that, what is the instance of a database manager? If that's a person in your company, the manager who manages all the databases, it maybe makes sense. But if it's an abstract thing in your code, which just manages all the databases your application uses, there might be a better name available. Using names like this might make sense if it's mostly a static class full of utility methods or anything like that, but typically you want to avoid them and you want to go for the clearer names instead, which can also be instantiated. And that's really all you gotta know about classes. They should describe the object which is built with help of the class. So now it's again time for more examples, this time focused on classes. And again, we got these three kinds of names, and the question is which kind of object is described. And let's say that is a user again. How should the classes be named then? When it comes to bad names, we could use something like uEntity or Object A. These, again, are very unspecific. They could hold anything. These are not the names you want to use. Better names would be something like UserObject or AppUser. These names are okay, but actually we have redundant information in there. Of course, a user is an object, and of course, a user in our application is an application user. So using these names might not make too much sense unless you have a very good reason for doing that. Now, good names could be just user or the more specific kind of user, admin, or also customer, and so on. This is fine and specific enough, or in the case of admin, even very specific. So these are great names to use. And that, of course, again means that it's now time for you to practice this. Again, take the chance to pause the video and then come up with some names for a database, which should be described by a class. So let's say you are creating a class which then has methods which you can use in your code for connecting to a database and for sending queries to that database. That would be a thing you definitely have in a lot of applications, and the question now is, how could you name such a class? Here are some bad names. The problem with these is that data and data storage are very unspecific or even describing the wrong thing. data storage doesn't have to be a database. It could also be a file storage or a storage in memory. So this is very unspecific and even a bit misleading. Better names could be DB or just data, but it's still not 100% specific. Especially data is almost a bad name because data again could be anything. So this might not even be okay. Now, good names on the other hand are of course database or the specific kind of database which is being created. If you have a SQL database and your class has all the methods it needs for interacting with this kind of database, SQL database of course is a great name.